Welcome to my book nook.
Welcome back to my book nook. We're in the middle of The Memory Keeper's Daughter by Kim Edwards, and let's just jump right in. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. We're in September of 1977. Caroline caught the corner of the Polaroid between her thumb and first finger as it slipped from the camera, the image already emerging. The table with its white cloth appeared to float on a sea of dark grass. Moonflowers, white and faintly luminous, climbed the hillside. Phoebe was a pale blur in her confirmation dress. Caroline waved the photo dry in the fragrant air. There was thunder far away. A late summer storm gathering. A rising breeze stirred the paper napkins. "One more," she said. "Oh, Mom," Phoebe protested, but she stood still. The minute the camera clicked, she was off, running across the lawn to where their neighbor, Avery, age 8, was holding a tiny kitten with hair the same dark orange as her own. Phoebe, at 13, was short for her age, chubby, still impulsive and impassioned, slow to learn but moving from joy to pensiveness to sadness and back to joy with an astonishing speed. "I'm confirmed!" she shouted now, turning once on the lawn with her arms flung high in the air, causing the guests to glance her way, drinks in their hands, and smile. Skirts swirling, she ran to Sandra's son, Tim, now a teenager too. She wrapped her arms around him, kissing him exuberantly on the cheek. Then she caught herself and glanced back anxiously at Caroline. Hugging had been a problem earlier this year at school. "I like you," Phoebe would announce, enveloping a smaller child. She didn't understand why she couldn't hug everyone. Caroline had told her again and again, hugs are special. Hugs are for family. Slowly, Phoebe had learned. Now, however, seeing Phoebe rein in her love, she wondered if she'd done the right thing. "It's okay, honey," Caroline called. "It's okay to hug your friends at the party." Phoebe relaxed, and she and Tim went off to pet the kitten. Caroline looked at the Polaroid in her hand, the luminous garden and Phoebe's smile. A fleeting moment caught, already gone. There was more thunder in the distance, but the evening was still lovely, warm and beautiful with flowers. All across the lawn, people moved, talking and laughing and filling their plastic cups. A cake, 3 tiers in frosted white, stood on the table, decorated with dark red roses from the garden. 3 layers for 3 celebrations. Phoebe's confirmation, her own wedding anniversary, and Doro's retirement. A bon voyage. "It's my cake," Phoebe's voice floated over the rise and fall of conversations. The physics professors and neighbors and choir members and school friends, families from the Upside Down Society, all sorts of children running. Caroline's new friends from the hospital where she had started working part-time once Phoebe was in school were here too. She had brought all these people together. She had planned this beautiful party unfolding in the dusk like a flower. "It's my cake," Phoebe's voice came again, high and floating. "I'm confirmed." Caroline sipped her wine, the air warm as breath on her skin. She didn't see Al arrive, but he was suddenly there, sliding a hand around her waist and kissing her cheek. His presence, his scent sweeping through her. 5 years ago they had married at a garden party much like this one. Strawberries floating in champagne and the air full of fireflies. The scent of roses. 5 years, and the novelty had not worn off. Caroline's room on the 3rd floor of Doro's house had become a place as mysterious and sensual as this garden. She loved waking to the warm, heavy length of Al waking to the warm, heavy length of Al sleeping beside her, his hand coming to rest lightly on the flat of her belly, the scent of him, fresh soap and Old Spice, slowly infusing the room, the sheets, the towels. He was there, so vividly present she felt him in every nerve, there and then as quickly gone. "Happy anniversary," he said, now pressing his hands lightly on her waist. Caroline smiled, filled with pleasure. The evening had deepened and people were moving and laughing in the lingering warmth and fragrance. Dew gathering on the darkening grass, the white froth of flowers everywhere. She took Al's hand, solid and sure, and almost laughed because he had just arrived and didn't know yet the news. Doro was leaving on a year-long cruise around the world with her lover, a man named Trace. Al knew that already. Plans had been evolving for months, but he didn't know that Dora, in what she called a joyful liberation from the past, had given Caroline the deed to this old house. Doro was arriving even now, coming down the stairs from the alley in a silky dress. Trace was just behind her, carrying a bag of ice. He was a year younger than she, 65, with short gray hair, a long narrow face, full lips. He was naturally pale, conscious of his weight, and fussy about his food. A lover of opera and sports cars. Trace had been an Olympic swimmer once. He had almost won a bronze medal, and he thought nothing still of diving into the Mauna Galea and swimming to the opposite shore. One afternoon, he had risen out of the water and staggered up the riverbank, pale and dripping, into the middle of the annual picnic for the Department of Physics. That was the story of their meeting. Trace was kind and good to Doro, who clearly adored him, and if he seemed aloof to Caroline, a bit distant and reserved, it really wasn't any of her business. A gust swept a pile of napkins off the table, and Caroline stooped to catch them. "You're bringing the wind," Elle said as Doro drew near. "It's so exciting," she said, lifting her hands. She had come to resemble Leo more and more, her features sharper, her hair short now, pure white. "Owls like those old mariners," Trace said, putting the ice on the table. Caroline used a small stone to weigh down the napkins. "He's attuned to atmospheric changes. Oh, Doro, stay just as you are," he exclaimed. "God, you're beautiful. Honestly, you look like a goddess of the wind." "If you're the wind goddess," Al said, catching the paper plates as they lifted, "you'd better cool your jets so we can have this party." "Isn't it glorious?" Doro asked. "It's such a beautiful party, a wonderful farewell." Phoebe ran up, holding the tiny kitten, a ball of pale orange in her arms. Caroline reached out and smoothed her hair, smiling. "Can we keep him?" she said. "No," Caroline replied, as she always did. "Aunt Doro's allergic." "Mom," Phoebe complained, but she was distracted at once by the wind. The beautiful table. She tugged on Doro's silky sleeve. "Aunt Doro, it's my cake!" "Mine too," Doro said, putting one arm around Phoebe's shoulders. "I'm going on a trip. Don't forget, so it's my cake too, and your mother's and Al's, because they've been married 5 years. "I'm coming on the trip," Phoebe said. "Oh no, sweetie," Doro said, "not this time. This is a grown-up trip, honey, for me and Trace." Phoebe's expression was touched with a disappointment as acute as her earlier joy. Mercurial, quicksilver, whatever she felt in each moment was the world. "Hey, sweetie," Al said, squatting down. "What do you think? You think that kitty cat might like some cream?" She fought a smile and then gave in, nodding, distracted for the moment from her loss. "Great," Al said, taking her hand, winking at Caroline. "Don't take that cat inside," Caroline warned. She filled a tray with glasses and moved along her guests, still marveling. She was Caroline Simpson, mother of Phoebe, wife of Al, organizer of protests, a different person altogether from the timid woman who had stood in a silent, snow-swept office 13 years ago with an infant in her arms. She turned to look at the house, the pale brick strangely vivid against the graying sky. "It's my house," she thought, echoing Phoebe's earlier chant. She smiled at her next thought, strangely apropos. "I'm confirmed." Sandra was laughing with Doro by the honeysuckle bush, and Mrs. Sollard was walking up the alley with a vase full of lilies. Trace, wind pushing his gray hair into his face, cupped a match in his hand, trying to light the candles. The flames flickered, sputtered, but finally held, illuminating the white linen tablecloth, the small transparent votive cups, the vase of white flowers, and the whipped cream cake. Cars rushed past, muted by the laughing voices and the fluttering leaves. For a moment Caroline stood still, thinking of Al, his hands reaching for her in the darkness of the night to come. "This is happiness," she told herself. "This is what happiness means." The party lasted until 11. Doro and Trace lingered after the last guest had left, carrying trays of cups and leftover cake, vases of flowers, putting tables and chairs away in the garage. Phoebe was asleep by then. Al had carried her inside after she dissolved into tears, tired and overstimulated, overcome with Doro's leaving, weeping with great heaving sobs that left her breathless. "Don't do any more," Caroline said, stopping Doro at the top of the steps, brushing past the dense, supple leaves of the lilacs. She had planted this hedge 3 years ago, and now the bushes, just twigs for so long, had taken root and shot up. Next year they would be heavy with flowers. "I'll clean up tomorrow, Doro. You have an early flight. You must be eager to get off." I am, Doro said, her voice so soft Caroline had to strain to hear her. She nodded to the house where Al and Trace were working in the bright kitchen, scraping plates. But Caroline, it's so bittersweet. Earlier I walked through all the rooms one last time. I've spent my whole life here. It's strange to leave it, yet all the same, I'm excited to be going. You can always come back, Caroline said, fighting a sudden swell of emotion. I hope I won't want to, Doro said, not for more than a visit. Anyway, she took Caroline's elbow. Come on, let's go sit on the porch. They walked along the side of the house under arching wisteria and sat in the swing, a river of cars moving by on the parkway. The high leaves of the sycamores, big as plates, fluttered against the streetlights. You won't miss the traffic, Caroline said. No, that's true. It used to be so quiet. They used to close the whole street off in the winter. We rode our sled straight down the middle of the road, right here. Caroline pushed the swing, remembering that long-ago night when moonlight flooded the lawns and fell through the bathroom windows, Phoebe coughing in her arms and herons rising from the fields of Doro's childhood. The screen door swung open and Trace stepped out. Well, he asked, are you about ready, Doro? Just about, she said. I'll go get the car then and bring it around front. He went back inside, and Caroline counted cars, up to 20. A dozen years ago she had come to this door, Phoebe an infant in her arms. She had stood right here waiting to see what would happen. What time's your flight? She asked. Early. At 8. Oh, Caroline, Doro said, leaning back and stretching her arms wide. After all these years, I feel so free. Who knows where I might fly? I'll miss you, Caroline said. Phoebe will too. Doro nodded. I know, but we'll see each other. I'll send postcards from everywhere. Headlights poured down the hill, and then the rental car was slowing, and Trace's long arm was lifting to wave. It's the call of the road, he shouted. Be well, Caroline said, and she hugged Doro, feeling her soft cheek. You saved my life all those years ago, you know. Honey, you saved mine too, Doro pulled away. Her dark eyes were wet. It's your house now. Enjoy it. And then Doro was down the steps, her white sweater catching in the wind. She was in the car, waving goodbye. And then she was gone. Caroline watched the car merge onto the crosstown and disappear into the river of rushing lights. The storm was still circling in the hills, flashing the sky white, dull thunder echoing far away. Al came out with drinks, pushing the door open with his foot, and they sat down in the swing. So, Al said, nice party. It was, Caroline said. It was fun. I'm exhausted. Have energy enough to open this? Al asked. Caroline took the package and undid the clumsy wrapping. A wooden heart fell out, carved from cherry, smooth as a water-worn stone in her palm. She closed her hand around it, remembering the way the medallion had glinted in the cold light of Al's cab, and how months later Phoebe's tiny hand had caught it. It's beautiful, she said, pressing the smooth heart against her cheek. So warm. It fits right here exactly in the palm of my hand. I carved it myself, Al said, pleasure in his voice. Nights on the road. Thought it might be kind of hokey, but this waitress I know in Cleveland said you'd like it. I hope you do. I do, Caroline said, linking her arm in his. I got something for you, too. And she handed him a small cardboard box. I didn't have time to wrap it. He opened the box and took out a new brass key. What's this? The key to your heart? She laughed. No, it's the key to this house. Why? Did you change the locks? She laughed. No. Caroline pushed at the swing. Doro gave it to me. Al, isn't that amazing? I have the deed inside. She said she wanted a completely fresh start. 1 heartbeat, 2, 3, and the creak of the swing back and forth. That's pretty extreme, Al said. What if she wants to come back? I asked her the same thing. She said Leo had left a lot of money. Patents, savings, I don't know what all. And Doro was thrifty her whole life. So she doesn't need the money. If they come back, she and Trace will get a condo or something. Generous, Al said. Yeah. Al was silent. Caroline listened to the porch swing creaking, the wind, the cars. We could sell it, he mused, take off ourselves, go anywhere. It's not worth much, Caroline said slowly. The idea of selling this house had never crossed her mind. Anyway, where would you go? Where would we go? I don't know, Caroline. You know me. I spent life wandering. I'm just speculating here, taking in the news. The comfort of the darkness, the steady swing, gave way to a deeper unease. Who was this man next to her? Caroline wondered. This man who arrived every weekend and slipped so familiarly into her bed, who tipped his head at a particular angle every morning to slap Old Spice on his neck and chin. What did she really know about his dreams and his secret heart? Next to nothing, it suddenly seemed. Or he of hers. So you'd rather not have a house? She pressed. It's not that. That was good of Doro. But it ties you down. I like coming home to you, Caroline. I like coming down the last stretch of highway and knowing you and Phoebe are here in the kitchen cooking or planting flowers or whatever. But sure, it's appealing what they're doing, packing up, taking off, wandering the world. It would be nice, I think, that freedom. I don't have those urges anymore, Caroline said, looking out into the dark garden, the scattering of city lights and the dark red letters of the Foodland sign, mosaic pieces amid the dense summer. I'm happy right where I am. You'll get bored with me. Nah, that just makes us compatible, honey, Al said. They sat in silence for a time, listening to the wind, the rush of cars. Phoebe doesn't like change, Caroline said. She doesn't handle it well. Well, there's that too, Al said. He waited a moment and then he turned to her. You know, Caroline, Phoebe's starting to grow up and she's starting not to be a little girl anymore. She's barely 13, Caroline said, thinking of Phoebe with the kitten. How easily she slipped back into the carefree joys of childhood. That's right. She's 13, Caroline. She's, well, starting to develop. I feel uncomfortable picking her up like I did tonight. So don't, Caroline said sharply, but she was remembering Phoebe in the pool earlier in the week, swimming away and then returning, grabbing hold of her underwater, the soft rising buds of her breast pressed against her arm. You don't have to get mad, Caroline. It's just that we never once talked about it, have we? What's going to become of her? What'll it be like for us when we retire, like Doro and Trace? He paused, and she had the sense that he was choosing his words carefully. I'd like to think we might consider traveling. It makes me a little less claustrophobic. That's all. To imagine staying in this house forever. And what about Phoebe? Will she live with us forever? I don't know, Caroline said, weariness around her, dense as night. She'd fought so many fights already to make a life for Phoebe in this indifferent world. For the time being, she had all the problems solved. For the last year or so, she'd be able to relax, but where Phoebe would work and how she might live when she grew up, all this remained unknown. Oh, Al, I can't think about all this tonight. Please. The porch swing glided back and forth. We'll need to think about it sometime. She's just a little girl. What are you suggesting? Caroline, I'm not suggesting anything. You know I love Phoebe. But you or I, we could die tomorrow. We're not always going to be around to take care of her, that's all. And there may come a time when she doesn't want us to. I'm just asking if you've thought about this. What you're saving all that money for. I'm just raising the topic for discussion. I mean, think about it. Wouldn't it be nice if you could come on the road with me now and again? Just for a weekend? Yeah, she said softly, that would be nice. But she wasn't sure. Caroline tried to imagine Al's life. A different room every night, a different city, and the road unfurling in the same gray ribbon. His first thought had been a restless one. Sell the house, hit the road, roam the world. Al nodded, drained his glass, and started to stand up. Don't go just yet, she said, putting her hand lightly on his arm. I have to talk to you about something. Sounds serious, he said, settling back into the swing, and he gave a nervous laugh. You're not leaving me, are you, now that you've come into this inheritance and all? Of course not. It's nothing like that, she sighed. I got a letter this week, she said. It's a strange letter, and I need to talk about it. A letter from who? From Phoebe's father. Al nodded and folded his arms, but he didn't speak. He knew about the letters, of course. They'd been arriving for years, bearing cash in varying amounts and a note with a single scrawled sentence. Please let me know where you are living. She had not done this, but in the early years she'd told David Henry everything else. Heartfelt confessional letters, as if he were a friend close to her heart, a confidant. As time passed, she'd become more efficient, sending photos and a line or two at best. Her life had become so full and rich and complicated there was no way to get it all down on paper. So she had simply stopped trying. What a shock it had been then to find a fat letter from David Henry, 3 full pages, written in his tight script, a passionate letter that started with Paul, his talent and his dreams, his rage and his anger. I know it was a mistake what I did, handing you my daughter. I know it was a terrible thing, and I know I can't undo it. But I would like to meet her, Caroline. I would like to make amends somehow. I'd like to know something more about Phoebe and about your lives. She was unnerved by the images he'd given her. Paul, a teenager, playing the guitar and dreaming of Juilliard. Nora, with her own business, and David, fixed in her mind all these years as clearly as the photograph in a book. Bent over this piece of paper, filled with regret and yearning, she'd slipped the letter into a drawer as if this might contain it. But the words had hovered in her mind through every moment of this task-filled and emotional week. He wants to meet her, Caroline said, fingering the fringe of a shawl Doro had tossed over the arm of the swing. To be a part of her life again somehow. Nice of him, Al said. What a stand-up guy after all this time. Caroline nodded. He is her father, though. Which makes me wonder. What? Which makes me what, I wonder. Please, Caroline said, you're the father Phoebe knows and loves, but I didn't tell you everything, Al, about how I came to have Phoebe, and I think I'd better. He took her hand in his. Caroline, I hung around in Lexington after you left. I talked to that neighbor of yours, and I heard lots of stories. Now, I didn't get much schooling, but I'm not a stupid man, and I know that Dr. David Henry lost a baby girl about the time he left town. What I'm saying is that whatever happened between the two of you doesn't matter. Not to me, not to us, so I don't need the details. She sat in silence, watching cars rush by on the highway. He didn't want her, she said. He was going to put her in a home, an institution. He asked me to take her there, and I did, but I couldn't leave her there. It was an awful place. Al didn't speak for a while. I've heard of things like that, he said at last. I've heard those kinds of stories on the road. You were brave, Caroline. You did the right thing. It's hard to think of Phoebe growing up in any place like that. Caroline nodded, tears in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Al. I should have told you years ago. Caroline, he said, it's okay. It's water under the bridge. What do you think I should do? She asked. I mean, about this letter. Should I answer it? Let him meet her? I don't know. He's been tearing at me all week. What if he took her away? I don't know what to tell you, he said slowly. It's not for me to decide. She nodded. That was fair, the consequence of having kept this to herself. But I'll support you, Al added, pressing her hand. Whatever you feel is best, I'll support you and Phoebe 100%. Thank you. I was so worried. You worry too much about the wrong things, Caroline. It doesn't touch us, then? She asked. The fact that I didn't tell you this before, it doesn't touch you and me? Not with a 100-foot pole, he said. Okay, then. Okay, he stood up, stretching. Long day. You coming up? In a minute, yeah. The screen door squeaked open, fell shut. The wind moved through the place where he had been sitting. It began to rain softly against the roof at first, and then a drumming. Caroline locked the house, her house now. Upstairs, she paused to check on Phoebe. Her skin was warm and damp. She stirred, and her mouth worked around unspoken words, and then she settled back into her dreams. Sweet girl, Caroline whispered, and covered her. She stood for a minute in the rain, echoing room, moved by Phoebe's smallness, by all the ways she would not be able to protect her daughter in the world. Then she went to her own room, slipping between the cool sheets next to Al. She remembered his hands on her skin, the press of his beard against her neck, and her own cries in the darkness. A good husband to her, a good father to Phoebe. A man who would get up on Monday morning and shower and dress and disappear in his truck for the week, trusting her to do whatever she felt was best about David Henry and his letter. Caroline lay for a long time, listening to the rain, her hand resting on his chest. She woke at dawn, Al thundering down the stairs to take the rig in early for an oil change. Rain cascaded from the gutters, and the downspouts teemed in puddles and poured downhill in a stream. Caroline went downstairs and made coffee, so absorbed in her own thoughts, in the strangeness of the silent house, that she didn't hear Phoebe until she was standing in the doorway behind her. Rain, Phoebe said. Her bathrobe hung loosely around her. Cats and dogs. Yes, Caroline said. They'd spent hours once learning this idiom. Working with a poster Caroline made of angry clouds, cats and dogs teeming from the sky. It was one of Phoebe's favorites. More like giraffes and elephants today. Cows and pigs, Phoebe said. Pigs and goats. Do you want some toast? Want a cat, Phoebe said. What do you want? Caroline asked. Use your sentences. I want a cat, please, Phoebe said. We can't have a cat. Aunt Dora went away, Phoebe said. I can have a cat. Caroline's head ached. What will become of her? Look, Phoebe, here's your toast. We'll talk about the cat later, okay? I want a cat, Phoebe insisted. Later. A cat, Phoebe said. Damn it! The palm of Caroline's hand came down flat on the counter, startling them both. Don't talk to me any more about a cat, do you hear? Sit on the porch, Phoebe said, sullen now. Watch the rain. What do you want? Use your sentences. I want to sit on the porch and watch the rain. You'll get cold. I want... Oh, fine, Caroline interrupted, waving one hand. Fine. Go out, sit on the porch, watch the rain. Whatever. The door opened and swung shut. Caroline looked out to see Phoebe sitting on the porch swing with her umbrella open and her toast on her lap. She was angry with herself for losing her patience. It wasn't about Phoebe. It was just that Caroline didn't know how to answer David Henry, and she was afraid. She collected the photo albums and the stray pictures she'd been meaning to sort and sat on the sofa where she could keep an eye on Phoebe, masked by her umbrella, rocking in the porch swing. She spread the recent photos on the coffee table, took out a piece of paper, and wrote to David. Phoebe was confirmed yesterday. She was so sweet in her white dress, eyelet fabric with pink ribbons. She sang a solo at the church. I'm sending a picture of the garden party we had later. It's hard to believe how big she's gotten, and I'm starting to feel worried about what the future holds. I suppose this was what was on your mind the night you handed her to me. I've fought so hard all these years, and sometimes I'm terrified of what will happen next. And yet... Here she paused, wondering at her impulse to reply. It wasn't for the money. Every cent of it went into the bank over the years. Caroline had saved nearly $15,000 of it. All of it held in trust for Phoebe. Perhaps it was simply old habit, or to keep their connection alive. Perhaps Caroline had simply wanted him to understand what he was missing. Here, she wanted to say, grabbing David Henry by the collar, here is your daughter, Phoebe, 13 years old, a smile like the sun on her face. She put her pen down, thinking of Phoebe in her white dress, singing with the choir and holding the kitten. How could she tell him all this and then not honor his request to meet his daughter? Yet if he came here after all these years, what would happen then? She didn't think she loved him anymore, but maybe she did. Maybe she was still angry with him, too, for the choices he'd made, for never really seeing who she was. It troubled her to discover this hardness in her own heart. Sorry about the tears, friends. I can't imagine what she is feeling. But what if he had changed after all? What if he hadn't? He might hurt Phoebe, as it once hurt her without even knowing it had happened. She pushed the letter aside, and instead she paid some bills, then stepped outside to slip them in the mailbox. Phoebe was sitting on the front steps, holding her umbrella high against the rain. Caroline watched for a minute before she left the door fall shut and went to the kitchen to get another cup of coffee. She stood for a long time at the back door, gazing out the dripping leaves, the wet lawn, the little stream running down the sidewalk. A paper cup was lodged under a bush, a napkin turned to pulp by the garage. In a few hours Al would drive away again. She glimpsed it for a moment, how he might like the freedom. How he might feel like freedom. The rain came harder, suddenly hitting the roof, and something opened up in her heart, some powerful instinct that made Caroline turn and walk into the living room. She knew before she'd stepped out on the porch that she'd find it empty. The plate set neatly on the concrete floor, the swing still. Phoebe gone. Gone where? Caroline went to the edge of the porch and searched up and down the street through the teeming rain. A train sounded in the distance, and the road to the left climbed the hill to the tracks. To the right, it ended in the freeway entrance ramp. All right? Think, where would she go? Down the street, the Swan children were playing barefoot in the puddles, and Caroline remembered Phoebe saying earlier that morning, "I want a cat," and Avery standing at the party with the furry bundle in her arms. Remembered Phoebe, fascinated by its small, tiny sounds, and sure enough, when she asked the Swan children about Phoebe, they gestured across the road to the copse of trees. The kitten had run away. Phoebe and Avery had gone to rescue it. At the first break in traffic, Caroline darted across the road. The earth was saturated, water pooling in her footprints. She pushed through the brushy copse and broke at last into the clearing. Avery was there, kneeling by the pipe that drained water from the hills into the concrete ditch. Phoebe's yellow umbrella was discarded, like a flag beside her. "Avery!" She squatted down beside the girl, touched her wet shoulder. "Where's Phoebe?" "She went to get the cat," Avery said, pointing into the pipe. "It went in there." Caroline swore softly and knelt at the edge of the pipe. Cold water rushed against her knees, her hands. "Phoebe!" she cried, and her voice echoed in the darkness. "It's Mom! Honey, are you here?" Silence. Caroline inched her way inside. The water was so cold. Already her hands were numb. "Phoebe!" she shouted, her voice swelling. "Phoebe!" She listened hard. A sound, then faint. Caroline crawled a few feet further in, feeling her way through the cold, invisible, rushing water. Then her hand brushed fabric, cold, flesh, and Phoebe, trembling, was in her arms. Caroline held her close, remembering the night she'd carried Phoebe in the damp purple bathroom, urging her to breathe. "We have to get out of here, honey. We have to get out." But Phoebe wouldn't move. "My cat," she said, her voice high, determined, and Caroline felt the squirming beneath Phoebe's shirt, heard the small mewing. "It's my cat." "Forget the cat," Caroline shouted, and she pulled Phoebe gently in the direction she had come. "Come on, Phoebe, right now." "My cat," Phoebe said. "Okay," Caroline said, water rushing now around her knees. Okay, it's your cat. Just go." Phoebe began to move, inching slowly toward the circle of light. Finally, they emerged, cold water streaming around them in the concrete ditch. Phoebe was soaked, her hair plastered against her face, and the kitten was wet too. Through the trees, Caroline glimpsed her house, solid and warm, like a raft in the dangerous world. She imagined Al traveling some distant highway in the familiar comfort of these rooms that were her own. "It's all right," Caroline put her arm around Phoebe. The kitten twisted, thin claws scratching the back of her hands. The rain fell, dripping off the dark, vivid leaves. "There's the mailman," Phoebe said. "Yes," Caroline said, watching him climb the porch and slide the bills she'd put out in his leather bag. Her letter to David Henry sat unfinished on the table. She had stood at the back door watching the rain, thinking only of Phoebe's father, while Phoebe wandered into danger. It seemed like an omen suddenly. She let herself turn the fear she had felt at Phoebe's disappearance into anger. She wouldn't write to David again. He wanted too much from her, and he wanted it too late. The mailman walked back down the steps, his bright umbrella flashing. "Yes, honey," she said, stroking the kitten's bony head. "Yes, there he is." We are now in 1982. I was a senior in high school in 1982. Caroline stood at the bus stop near the corner of Forbes and Braddock, watching the kinetic energy of the children on the playground, their happy shouts lifting up over the steady roar of the traffic. Beyond them, on the baseball fields, figures in blue and red from competing local taverns moved with silent grace against new grass. It was spring. Evening was gathering. In a few minutes, the parents stood on the benches or standing with their hands in their pockets, would start calling the children to go home. The grown-ups game would continue to the edge of darkness, and when it ended, the players would slap each other on the back and depart too, settling in for drinks at the taverns. Their laughter loud and happy. She and Al saw them there when they made it out for an evening. An early show at the Regent, then dinner, and if Al wasn't on call, a couple of beers. Tonight he was gone, however, speeding far away through the gathering night, south from Cleveland to Toledo, then Columbus. Caroline had his routes hung on the refrigerator. Years ago, in those strange days after Doro left, Caroline had hired someone to watch Phoebe while she traveled with Al, hoping to bridge the distance between them. Hours slid away. She slept and woke and lost track of time, the road spinning out beneath them forever. A dark ribbon bisected by the steady flashes of white, seductive and mesmerizing. Finally, Al, bleary himself, would pull into a truck stop and take her to a restaurant that didn't differ appreciably from the one they had left behind in whatever city they'd stayed in the day before. Life on the road seemed like falling through strange holes in the universe, as if you might walk into a restroom in one city in America and then walk out the same door to find yourself somewhere else. The same strip malls and gas stations and fast food places, the same hum of wheels against the road. Only the names were different, the light, the faces. She'd gone with Al twice, then never again. The bus rounded the corner and roared to a stop. The doors folded open and Caroline climbed in and took a window seat, trees flashing as they roared over the bridge and the hollow below. Flying past the cemetery, lurching through Squirrel Hill, then lumbering on through the old neighborhoods to Oakland, where Caroline got off. She stood before the Carnegie Museum for a moment, collecting herself, looking up at the grand stone building with its cascading steps and ionic columns. A banner strung along the top of the portico flung in the wind, mirror images, photographs by David Henry. Tonight was the opening. He would be here to speak. Hands trembling, Caroline slid the newspaper clipping from her pocket. She had carried it for 2 weeks, her heart surging every time she touched it. A dozen times, perhaps more, she had changed her mind. What good could come of it? And then in the next breath, what harm? If Al had been here, she would have stayed home. She would have let the opportunity slip away unremarked, glancing at the clock until the opening was over and David Henry had disappeared back into whatever life he led now. But Al had called to say he'd be away tonight, and Mrs. O'Neill was home to keep an eye on Phoebe, and the bus had been on time. Caroline's heart was roaring now. She stood still, taking deep breaths while the world moved around her. The squill of brakes and the scent of spent fuel and the faint stirrings of the feathery new leaves of spring. Voices swelled as people drew nearer, then receded. Scraps of conversation drifting like bits of paper borne on the wind. Streams of people dressed in silk and heels and dark expensive suits flowed up the museum stone steps. The sky was a darkening indigo, and the streetlights had come on. The air was full of the scent of lemon and mint from the festival at the Greek Orthodox Church 1 block down. Caroline closed her eyes, thinking of black olives, which she had never tasted until she reached this city. Thinking of the wild mosaic of Saturday morning market at the Strip, fresh bread and flowers and fruit and vegetables, a riot of food and colorful blocks along the river. Something she would never have seen except for David Henry, and an unexpected snowstorm. She took one step and then another, merging with the crowd. The museum had high white ceilings and oak floors polished to a dark gleaming gold. Caroline was given a program of thick creamy paper with David Henry's name across the top. A list of photos followed. Dunes at dusk, then she read A Tree in the Heart. She walked into the gallery room and found his most famous photo, the undulating beach that was more than a beach, the curve of a woman's hip, then the smooth length of her leg hidden among the dunes. The image trembled on the edge of being something else, and then it suddenly was something else. Caroline had stared at it for a good 15 minutes for the first time she saw it, knowing that the swell of flesh belonged to Nora Henry, remembering the white hill of her belly rippling with contractions, the powerful force of her grip. For years she had consoled herself with her disdainful opinion of Nora Henry, a bit imperial, used to ease and order, a woman who might have left Phoebe in an institution. But this image exploded that idea. These photos showed a woman she had never known. People milled in the room, the seats filled. Caroline sat down, watching everything intently. The lights dimmed once and went on again, and then suddenly there was applause, and David Henry was walking in, tall and familiar, fleshier now, smiling at the audience. It shocked her to see that he was not a young man anymore. His hair was turning gray, and there was a slight bend to his shoulders. He walked to the podium and gazed out at the audience, and Caroline caught her breath. Sure, he must have seen her, must have known her at once. And she knew him. He cleared his throat and made a joke about the weather. As the laughter spilled out around her and died down, as he looked at his notes and began to speak, Caroline understood that she was just another face in the crowd. He spoke with melodious assurance, though Caroline paid almost no attention to what he was saying. Instead, she studied the familiar gestures of his hands, the new lines at the corners of his eyes. His hair was longer, thick, and luxurious despite the gray, and he seemed satisfied, settled. She thought of that night almost 20 years ago, when he'd woken and lifted his head from the desk and caught her in the doorway. Naked in her love for him, the two of them as vulnerable to each other in that moment as it was possible to be. She had recognized something then, something he kept hidden, some experience or expectation or dream too private to share. And it was true. She could see that still. David Henry had a secret life. Her mistake 20 years ago had been in believing that his secret had to do with any kind of love for her. When his talk was over, the applause rose strong, and then he was stepping from behind the podium, taking a long drink from his glass of water and answering questions. There were several, from a man with a notebook, a matron with gray hair, a young woman dressed in black with dark cascading hair who asked something rather angrily about form. Tension grew in Caroline's body, and her heart pounded until she could barely breathe. The questions ended, and the silence grew, and David Henry cleared his throat, a smile forming as he thanked the audience and turned away. Caroline felt herself rising then, almost beyond her own volition, her purse in front of her like a shield. She crossed the room and joined the little group collecting around him. He glanced at her and smiled politely without recognition. She waited through more questions, growing somewhat calmer as the moments passed. The curator of the show hovered at the edge of the group, anxious for David to mingle, but when a break came into the questions, Caroline stepped forward and put her hand on David's arm. "David," she said, "don't you know me?" He searched her face. "Have I changed that much?" she whispered. She saw him understand then. His face altered, the shape of it even as if gravity had suddenly gotten stronger. A flush crept up his neck and a muscle pulsed in his cheek. Caroline felt something strange happen with time, as if they were back at the clinic again all those years ago, the snow falling quietly outside. They stared at each other without speaking, as if the room and all the people in it had fallen away. "Caroline," he said at last, recovering. "Caroline Gill. An old friend," he added, speaking to the people still clustering around them. He reached up with one hand and adjusted his tie, and a smile broke across his face, though it did not touch his eyes. "Thank you," he said, nodding to the others. "Thank you all for coming. Now if you'll excuse us." Ooh. And then they were crossing the room. David walked beside her, one hand lightly but firmly against her back, as if she might disappear unless he held her in place. "Come in here," he said, stepping behind a display panel where an unframed door was barely visible in the white wall. He guided her inside swiftly and shut the door behind him. It was a storage closet, small, one bare bulb raining light down on shelves full of paint and tools. They stood face to face, just inches apart. His scent filled the room, the sweet cologne. And beneath it was a smell she remembered, something medicinal and tinged with adrenaline. The little room was hot, and she suddenly felt dizzy, silverfish flashing in her vision. "Caroline," he said, "good God, do you live here in Pittsburgh? Why wouldn't you tell me where you were?" "I wasn't hard to find. Other people found me," she said slowly, remembering Al walking up the alley, understanding for the first time the depth of his persistence. For if it was true that David Henry had not looked very hard, it was also true that she had wanted to be lost. Outside the door there were footsteps drawing near and then pausing. The rush and murmur of voices. She studied his face. All those years she'd thought about him every single day, and yet now she couldn't imagine what to say. "Shouldn't you be out there?" she asked, glancing at the door. "They'll wait." They looked at each other, then not speaking. Caroline had held him in her mind all this time like a photograph, 100 or 1,000 photographs. In each of these David Henry was a young man full of restless, determined energy, and now, staring at his dark eyes and fleshy cheeks, his hair so carefully styled, she realized that if she had passed him on the street, she might not have known him after all. When he spoke again, his tone had softened, though a muscle still worked in his face. "I went to your apartment, Caroline, that day after the memorial service. I went there, but you were already gone." "All this time," he began, and then he fell silent. There was a light tap on the door, a muffled, questioning voice. "Give me a minute," David called back. "I was in love with you," Caroline said in a rush, astonished at her confession, for it was the first time she'd ever voiced this, even to herself, though it was knowledge she had lived with for years. The admission made her feel lightheaded, reckless, and she went on, "You know, I spent all sorts of time imagining a life with you, And it was in that moment by the church when I realized I hadn't crossed your mind at all. Not really. His head bent. He bent his head as he spoke, and now he looked up. I knew, he said. I knew you were in love with me. How could I have asked you to help me otherwise? I'm sorry, Caroline. For years now I've been sorry. So sorry. She nodded, tears in her eyes, the younger version of herself, still alive, still standing by the edge of the memorial service, unacknowledged, invisible. It made her angry, even now that he had not really seen her then, and that not knowing her at all, he hadn't hesitated to ask her to take away his daughter. Are you happy? He asked. Have you been happy, Caroline? Has Phoebe? His questions and the gentleness in his voice disarmed her. She thought of Phoebe struggling to learn the shape of letters to tie her shoes. Oh, goodness. Phoebe playing happily in the backyard while Caroline made phone call after phone call, fighting for her education. Phoebe putting her soft arms around Caroline's neck for no reason at all and saying, I love you, Mom. She thought of Al, gone too much, but walking through the door at the end of the long week carrying flowers or something for Phoebe. When she'd worked in David Henry's office, she'd been so young, so lonely and naive that she imagined herself as some sort of vessel to be filled up with love. But it wasn't like that. The love was within her all this time, and its only renewal came from giving it away. Do you really want to know? She asked at last, looking him straight in the eye. Because you never wrote back, David, except for that one time. You never asked a single thing about our lives. Not for years. As Caroline spoke, she realized that this was why she had come. Not out of love at all, or any allegiance to the past, or even out of guilt. She had come out of anger and a desire to set the record straight. For years you never wanted to know how I was, how Phoebe was. You just didn't give a damn, did you? And then that last letter, the one I never answered, all of a sudden you wanted her back? David gave a short, startled laugh. Is that how you saw it? Is that why you stopped writing? How else could I see it? He shook his head slowly. Caroline, I asked you for your address again and again every time I sent money. And in the final letter, I simply asked you to invite me back into your life. What more could I do? Look, I know you don't realize this, but I kept every letter you ever sent, and when you stopped writing, I felt like you'd slammed a door in my face. Caroline thought of her letters, all her heartfelt confessions flowing into ink on paper. She couldn't remember anymore what she'd written. Details about Phoebe's life, her hopes, her dreams, and her fears. Where are they? She asked. Where do you keep my letters? He looked surprised. In my darkroom filing cabinet, bottom drawer. It's always locked. Why? I didn't think you even read them, Caroline said. I felt I was writing into a void. Maybe that's why I felt so free, like I could say anything at all. David rubbed his hand on his cheek. A gesture she remembered him using when he was so tired or discouraged. I read them. At first, I had to force myself, to be honest. Later, I wanted to know what was happening, even though it was painful. You gave me little glimpses of Phoebe. Little scraps from the fabric of your lives. I looked forward to that. She didn't answer, remembering the satisfaction she'd felt on that rainy day when she'd sent Phoebe upstairs with her kitten, Rain, to change out of her wet clothes while she stood in the living room, tearing his letter into confetti and dropping it in the trash. Satisfaction and a sense of pleasure at having the matter closed. She'd felt those things, oblivious, unconcerned even about what David had been feeling. I couldn't lose her, she said. I was angry with you for a long time, but by then I was mostly afraid that if you'd met her, you'd take her away. That's why I stopped writing. That was never my intention. You didn't intend any of this, Caroline answered, but it happened anyway. David Henry sighed, and she had imagined him in her deserted apartment, walking from room to room and realizing she was gone for good. Tell me your plans, Hit said. That's all I ask. If I hadn't taken her, she added softly, you might have chosen differently. I didn't stop you, he said, meeting her gaze again. His voice was rough. I could have. You wore a red coat that day at the memorial service. I saw you and I watched you drive away. Caroline felt suddenly depleted, almost faint. She did not know what she had hoped for from this night, but when she had imagined this conversation, she had not imagined this contention, his grief and anger, and her own. You saw me? She asked. I went straight to your apartment afterward. I expected you to be there. Caroline closed her eyes. She'd been driving toward the highway then, on her way here to this life. She'd probably missed David Henry's visit by minutes, an hour. How much had turned on that moment. How differently her life might have unfolded. You didn't answer me, David said, clearing his throat. Have you been happy, Caroline? Has Phoebe? Is her health okay? Her heart? Her heart's fine, Caroline said, thinking of the early years of constant worry over Phoebe's health. All the trips to the doctors and dentists and cardiologists and ear, nose, and throat specialists. But she had grown up. She was well. She shot baskets in the driveway and loved to dance. The books I read when she was still small predicted she'd be dead by now, but she's fine. She was lucky. I guess she never had a problem with her heart. She loves to sing. She has a cat named Rain. She's learning how to weave. That's where she is right now, at home, weaving. Caroline shook her head. She goes to school, public school, with all the other kids. I had to fight like hell for them to take her, and now she's nearly grown. I don't know what will happen. I'm so sorry, friends. This is the first time I've read this book, and you can tell I'm totally caught up in it. Does that take a little minute? Calm myself. Let's jump back in. Where Caroline is speaking. She's nearly grown, and I don't know what will happen. I have a good job. I work part-time in an internal medicine clinic at the hospital. My husband, he travels a lot. Phoebe goes to a group home each day. She has a lot of friends there, and she's learning how to do office work. But what else can I say? You missed a lot of heartache, sure. But David, you missed a lot of joy. I know that, he said, better than you think. And you? She asked, struck again by how he had aged, still trying to assimilate the fact of his presence here with her in this small room after all these years. Have you been happy? Has Nora and Paul? I don't know, he said slowly. As happy as anyone ever is, I suppose. Paul's so smart he could do anything. What he wants is to go to Juilliard and play the guitar, and I think he's making a mistake, but Nora doesn't agree. It's caused a lot of tension. Caroline thought of Phoebe, how she loved to clean and organize, how she sang to herself while washing the dishes or mopping the floors, how she loved music with her whole heart, and would never have a chance to play the guitar. And Nora, she asked. Well, she owns a travel agency, David said. She's away a lot, too, like your husband. A travel agency? Caroline asked. Nora? I know, it surprised me, too, but she's owned it for years now. She's very good at it. The doorknob turned and the door swung open a few inches, and the curator of the show stuck his head inside, his blue eyes bright with curiosity and concern. He ran one hand through his dark hair nervously as he spoke. Dr. Henry, he said, you know, there are a lot of people out here. There's a kind of expectation that you'll mingle. Is everything all right? David looked at Caroline. He was hesitating, but he was impatient too, and Caroline knew that in an instant he would turn, adjust his tie, and walk away. Something that had endured for years was ending in this moment. Don't, she thought, but the curator cleared his throat and gave an uncomfortable laugh. And David said, no problem, I'm coming. You'll stay, won't you? He said to Caroline, taking her elbow. I need to get home, she said. Phoebe's waiting. Please. He paused outside the door, and she met his eyes and saw the same sadness and compassion she'd remembered from so long ago when they were both so much younger. There's so much to say. It's been so many years. Please say you'll wait. It shouldn't be long. She felt sick to her stomach, an uneasiness she couldn't place, but she nodded slightly, and David Henry smiled. Good. We'll have dinner, all right? All this glad talk. I have to do it. But I was wrong all those years ago, and I want more than just the scraps. His hand was on her arm. and they were moving back into the crowd. Caroline couldn't seem to speak. People were waiting, glancing, frankly, in their direction, curious and whispering. She'd reached into her purse and handed David an envelope she'd prepared with the latest photographs of Phoebe. David took it, met her eyes, and nodded seriously, and then a slight woman in a black linen dress was taking him by the arm. It was the woman from the audience again, beautiful and faintly hostile, asking another question about form. Caroline stood where she was for a few minutes, watching him gesture to a photo that resembled the dark branches of a tree, talking to the woman in the black dress. He'd been handsome, and he was still. Twice he glanced in Caroline's direction, and then, seeing her, turned his attention fully to the moment. "Wait," he'd said. "Please wait." And he'd expected that she would. The sick feeling rose up in her stomach again. She didn't want to wait. That was it. She'd spent too much of her young life waiting. For recognition, for adventure, for love. It wasn't until she turned with Phoebe in her arms and left the home in Louisville, not until she packed up her things and moved away, that her life had really begun. Nothing good had ever come to her from waiting. David was standing with his head bent, nodding, listening to the woman with dark hair, the envelope clasped in his hands behind his back. As she watched, he reached up and put the envelope casually in his pocket as if it contained something trivial and mildly unpleasant. A utility bill, a traffic ticket. In moments she was outside, hurrying down the stone steps into the night. It was spring, the air crisp and damp, and Caroline was too agitated to wait for the bus. Instead, she walked quickly, block after block, oblivious to the traffic or the people passing, or even the slight danger involved in being out by herself at this hour. Moments came back to her in swirls and glimpses, strange, disconnected details. There had been a patch of dark hair over his right ear, and his fingernails had been clipped down to the quick. Square-tipped fingers, she remembered those, but his voice had changed, become more gravelly. It was disconcerting. The images she kept in her mind all this time had altered the moment she had seen him. And for herself, how had she seemed to him tonight? What had he seen? What had he ever seen of Caroline Lorraine Gill, of her secret heart? Nothing. Nothing at all. And she'd known that, too. She'd known it for years, ever since the moment outside the church when the circle of his life had closed against her. When she had turned and left, in some deep place in her heart, Caroline had kept alive the silly romantic notion that somehow David Henry had once known, as no one ever else could, had known her. But it was not true. He had never even glimpsed her. She had walked 5 blocks, and it had started to rain. Her face was wet, her coat and shoes. She was near a corner when a 61B squealed to a stop, and she ran to catch it, brushing off her hair, sitting on the cracked plastic of the seat. Lights, neon, and the watery red blur of the headlights moved across the windows. The early spring air was cool and damp on her face. The bus lumbered through the streets, picking up speed as it reached the dark stretches of the park, the long, low hill. She got off in the center of Regent Square. A roar, shouts swelled out of the tavern as she passed, and through the glass she glimpsed the shadowy figures of the players she had seen earlier, glasses in their hands now, and fists pumping in the air as they gathered around the television. Light from the jukebox cast stripes of neon blue across the arms of the waitresses as she turned from the table nearest the window. Caroline paused. The wild adrenaline rush of her meeting with David Henry suddenly gone, dissipated into the spring night like mist. She felt her own isolation acutely, the figures in the bar joined by a common purpose, the people moving around her on the sidewalk, drawn along the lines of their lives to places she could not even imagine. Tears rose in her eyes. The television screen flickered, and another cheer swelled through the glass. Caroline moved off, jostling a woman carrying a paper sack of groceries, stepping over a pile of fast food trash someone had left on the sidewalk. Down the hill and then up the alley to her house, the city lights giving way to those so well known and so familiar. The O'Neills, where a golden glow spilled out over the dogwood tree, the Sollards, with their dark stretch of garden, and finally the Margulies lawn, moonflowers growing wild up the hillside in the summertime, beautiful and chaotic. houses in a row like so many steps down a hill, and then finally her own. She paused in the alley, looking at her tall, narrow house. She had closed the blinds, she was sure of it, but now they were open and she could see clearly through the dining room windows. The chandelier glowed over the table where Phoebe had spread out her yarns. She was bent over the loom, moving the shuttle back and forth calmly, intently. Rain was curled on her lap, a fluffy orange ball. Caroline watched, worried at how vulnerable her daughter seemed, how exposed to the world that swirled so mysteriously in the darkness behind her. She frowned, trying to remember that moment. Her hand turning the narrow plastic sticks in the blinds falling closed. Then she glimpsed a movement deeper in the house, a shadow shifting beyond the French doors to the living room. Caroline caught her breath, startled but not yet alarmed, and then the shadow took shape and she relaxed. This was no stranger, but only Al, home early from his travels, puttering through the house. She was surprised and strangely gladdened. Al had been taking more jobs and was often gone 2 weeks at a time. But here he was, he had come home. He'd opened the blinds, giving her this moment to savor the glimpse of her life contained within these brick walls. Framed by the buffet she had refinished, the ficus tree she had not yet managed to kill off, the layers of glass and paint she had washed so lovingly all these years. Phoebe glanced up from her work, staring unseeing out the window at the dark, wet lawn, running her hand along the cat's soft back. Al walked through the room, holding a cup of coffee in one hand. He stood beside her and with his cup gestured to the rug she was weaving. It was raining harder now. Her hair was soaked, but Caroline didn't move. What had been an emptiness outside the tavern window, a bleak vacancy real enough and fearful, was banished by the sight of her family. Rain hit her cheeks and streaked down the windows, beaded on her good wool coat. She took off her gloves and fumbled in her purse for her keys, then realized that the door would be unlocked. In the darkness of the lawn, as the eternal cars swooshed past on the freeway, their headlights catching in the dense lilac bushes she had planted as a screen so many years ago, Caroline stood still a moment longer. This was her life. Not the life she had once dreamed of, not a life her younger self would have ever imagined or desired, but the life she was living, with all its complexities. This was her life built with care and attention, and it was good. She shut her purse then, she climbed the steps, and she pushed the back door open and went home. We're going to end right there. See you next time on The Book Nook.